Joe was very busy in the garret, for the October days began to grow chilly and the afternoons were short. For 2 or 3 hours the sun lay warmly in the high window, showing Joe seated on the old sofa, writing busily, with her papers spread out upon a trunk before her. Quite absorbed in her work, Joe scribbled away till the last page was filled, when she signed her name with a flourish and threw down her pen, exclaiming, "There! I've done my best. If this won't suit, I shall have to wait till I can do better." Joe picked up another manuscript and, putting both in her pocket, crept quietly downstairs. She put on her hat and jacket as noiselessly as possible, and going to the back entry window, got out upon the roof of a low porch, swung herself down to the grassy bank, and took a roundabout way to the road. Once there, she composed herself, hailed a passing omnibus, and rolled away to town, looking very merry and mysterious. If anyone had been watching her, he would have thought her movements decidedly peculiar, for on alighting, she went off at a great pace till she reached a certain number in a certain busy street. Having found the place with some difficulty, she went into the doorway, looked up the dirty stairs, and after standing stock still a minute, suddenly dived into the street and walked away as rapidly as she came. This maneuver she repeated several times, to the great amusement of a black-eyed young gentleman lounging in the window of a building opposite. On returning for the third time, Joe gave herself a shake, pulled her hat over her eyes, and walked up the stairs, looking as if she were going to have all her teeth out. There was a dentist's sign among others which adorned the entrance, and after staring a moment at the pair of artificial jaws, which slowly opened and shut to draw attention to a fine set of teeth, the young gentleman put on his coat, took his hat, and went down to post himself in the opposite doorway, saying, with a smile and a shiver, "It's like her to come alone, but if she has a bad time, she'll need someone to help her home." In 10 minutes, Joe came running downstairs with a very red face and the general appearance of a person who had just passed through a trying ordeal of some sort. When she saw the young gentleman, she looked anything but pleased and passed him with a nod, but he followed, asking with an air of sympathy, "Did you have a bad time?" "Not very." "You got through quickly." "Yes, thank goodness." "Why did you go alone?" "Didn't want anyone to know." "You're the oddest fellow I ever saw. How many did you have out?" Joe looked at her friend as if she did not understand him, then began to laugh as if mightily amused at something. "There are 2 which I want to have come out, but I must wait a week." "What are you laughing at? You are up to some mischief, Joe," said Laurie, looking mystified. "So are you. What were you doing, sir, up in that billiard saloon?" "Begging your pardon, ma'am. It wasn't a billiard saloon, but a gymnasium, and I was taking a lesson in fencing." "I'm glad of that."
"Why?"
"You can teach me, and then when we play Hamlet, you can be Laertes, and we'll make a fine thing of the fencing scene. And I was glad that you were not in the saloon, because I hope you never go to such places. Do you?"
"Not often."
"I wish you wouldn't."
"It's no harm, Joe. I have billiards at home, but it's no fun unless you have good players. So, as I'm fond of it, I come sometimes and have a game with Ned Moffat or some of the other fellows. Can't a fellow take a little innocent amusement now and then without losing his respectability?"
"That depends upon how and where he takes it. I don't like Ned and his set, and wish you'd keep out of it. Mother won't let us have him at our house, though he wants to come, and if you grow like him, she won't be willing to have us frolic together as we do now." Laurie walked in silence a few minutes.
"Are you going to deliver lectures all the way home?"
he asked presently. "Of course not. Why?"
"Because if you are, I'll take a bus. If you're not, I'd like to walk with you and tell you something very interesting."
"I won't preach any more, and I'd like to hear the news immensely."
"Very well, then. Come on. It's a secret, and if I tell you, you must tell me yours."
"I haven't got any," began Joe, but stopped suddenly, remembering that she had. "Is your secret a nice one?"
"Oh, isn't it? All about people you know and such fun. You ought to hear it, and I've been aching to tell it this long time. Come, you begin."
"You'll not say anything about it at home, will you?"
"Not a word."
"Well,
I've left 2 stories with a newspaper man, and he's to give his answer next week," whispered Jo in her confidante's ear. "Hurrah for Miss March, the celebrated American authoress!" cried Laurie, throwing up his hat and catching it again, to the great delight of 2 ducks, 4 cats, 5 hens, and half a dozen Irish children, for they were out of the city now. "Hush! It won't come to anything, I dare say. But I couldn't rest till I had tried, and I said nothing about it because I didn't want anyone else to be disappointed." "It won't fail. Why, Jo, your stories are works of Shakespeare compared to half the rubbish that is published every day. Won't it be fun to see them in print? And shan't we feel proud of our authoress?" Jo's eyes sparkled, for it is always pleasant to be believed in, and a friend's praise is always sweeter than a dozen newspaper puffs. "Where's your secret? Play fair, Teddy, or I'll never believe you again." "I may get into a scrape for telling, but I didn't promise not to, so I will, for I never feel easy in my mind till I've told you any plummy bit of news I get. I know where Meg's glove is." "Is that all?" said Jo, looking disappointed, as Laurie nodded and twinkled with a face full of mysterious intelligence. "It's quite enough for the present, as you'll agree when I tell you where it is." "Tell, then." Laurie bent and whispered 3 words in Jo's ear, which produced a comical change. She stood and stared at him for a minute, looking both surprised and displeased, then walked on, saying sharply, "How do you know?" "Saw it." "Where?" "Pocket." "All this time?" "Yes. Isn't that romantic?" "No, it's horrid." "Don't you like it?" "Of course I don't. It's ridiculous. It won't be allowed. My patience! What would Meg say?" "You are not to tell anyone. Mind that." "I didn't promise." "That was understood, and I trusted you." "Well, I won't for the present anyway, but I'm disgusted and wish you hadn't told me." "I thought you'd be pleased." "At the idea of anybody coming to take Meg away? No, thank you." "You'll feel better about it when somebody comes to take you away." "I'd like to see anyone try it," cried Jo fiercely. "So should I," and Laurie chuckled at the idea. "I don't think secrets agree with me. I feel rumpled up in my mind since you told me that," said Jo rather ungratefully. "Race down this hill with me and you'll be all right," suggested Laurie. No one was in sight. The smooth road sloped invitingly before her, and finding the temptation irresistible, Jo darted away, soon leaving hat and comb behind her and scattering hairpins as she ran. Laurie reached the goal first, and was quite satisfied with the success of his treatment, for his Atalanta came panting up with flying hair, bright eyes, ruddy cheeks, and no signs of dissatisfaction in her face. For a week or 2, Jo behaved so queerly that her sisters were quite bewildered. She rushed to the door when the postman rang, was rude to Mr. Brooke whenever they met, would sit looking at Meg with a woebegone face, occasionally jumping up to shake and then kiss her in a very mysterious manner. On the 2nd Saturday after Jo got out of the window, Meg, as she sat sewing at her window, was scandalized by the sight of Laurie chasing Jo all over the garden and finally capturing her in Amy's bower. What went on there, Meg could not see, but shrieks of laughter were heard, followed by the murmur of voices and a great flapping of newspapers. "What shall we do with that girl? She never will behave like a young lady," sighed Meg, as she watched the race with a disapproving face. In a few minutes, Jo bounced in, laid herself on the sofa, and affected to read. "Have you anything interesting there?" asked Meg with condescension. "Nothing but a story. Won't amount to much, I guess," returned Jo, carefully keeping the name of the paper out of sight. "You'd better read it aloud. That will amuse us and keep you out of mischief," said Amy in her most grown-up tone. "What's the name?" asked Beth, wondering why Jo kept her face behind the sheet. "The Rival Painters." "That sounds well. Read it," said Meg. With a loud "hem" and a long breath, Jo began to read very fast. The girls listened with interest, for the tale was romantic and somewhat pathetic, as most of the characters died in the end. "I like that about the splendid picture," was Amy's approving remark, as Jo paused. "I prefer the lovering part.
Viola and Angelo are two of our favorite names. Isn't that queer?" said Meg, wiping her eyes, for the lovering part was tragical. "Who wrote it?" asked Beth, who had caught a glimpse of Joe's face. The reader suddenly sat up, cast away the paper, displaying a flushed countenance, and, with a funny mixture of solemnity and excitement, replied in a loud voice, "Your sister." "You!" cried Meg, dropping her work. "It's very good," said Amy critically. "I knew it! I knew it! Oh, my Joe, I am so proud!" And Beth ran to hug her sister and exult over this splendid success. Dear me, how delighted they all were, to be sure. How Meg wouldn't believe it till she saw the words Miss Josephine March actually printed in the paper. How graciously Amy criticized the artistic parts of the story and offered hints for a sequel, which, unfortunately,